Hello, my name is Jeffrey Nicholas. I'm a professor of philosophy at Providence College. This is a 5-part lecture series on guns, germs, and steel. Lecture 1 covered Yali's question, which is why did the Europeans come to dominate the rest of the world, including New Guinea, where he's from. Lecture 2 talked about some of the issues in human development of societies from Eden to Cajamarca, and looking at differences between people in these areas. Lecture 3 and 4 was about food production, looking at the advantages of the Fertile Crescent and the Eurasian continents in comparison primarily to the Americas in terms of food possibilities and domesticable animals. And this is lecture 5, which is from luck to germs and steel. So what we saw in our last lecture was that the possibility of growing food in Eurasia was much greater and provided greater resources for calories and proteins than it did in other parts of the world. And so this allowed a denser population to arise, which allowed for specialization of different artisans and craft work. What we want to do then is connect those arguments of the denser population and craft work to germs and steel and its role, their role in the conquering of the Americas. So Diamond's argument again is primarily about luck and is an argument against the idea that there are variations in races that led to Europeans dominating the world. And so if you look at the center of this map here, sorry, I didn't mean to move it, geographic luck plays a primary role in many of these other issues that we can talk about. Domesticable animals, which leads to milk and meat. These are available in the Fertile Crescent and not in other areas. And so that leads to ability to develop, say, cows and horses for work. We also have the development of germs, which we're going to talk about, the development of reading and writing, which we mentioned early on, various climate conditions that are possible here. So luck plays a significant role in the differences of development in human societies. We want to turn our attention now to the development of disease, and then we will talk about technology. So domesticable animals are primarily, the ones that were domesticated were primarily in the Eurasian area. And what we see historically is that people Europeans lived in close proximity with these animals, sometimes in the same building. So Christians, for example, take it as truth that Jesus was born in a stable, but this would not have been too uncommon in that time period, because stables would have been part of the primary house if the family had domesticated animals, and sometimes those animals would actually live in the house, partly because they provided warmth, right? Those large bodies provide warmth so that you have to use less fuel in terms of keeping the house warm. But this also leads to the fact that diseases transferred easily from animals into human beings. We see this most recently with the COVID-19 disease, but we've seen this in many other cases as well, so that various diseases transfer from animals, and this living in close proximity with the animals allowed that transfer of disease. Now, because these domesticated animals are within a certain geographic region, the luck here might seem disadvantageous at first, but what it did was it led to a resistance, a herd immunity, if you will, among Europeans that people in the Americas and other places in the world did not have. So that when the HMS Chatham landed on the Chatham Islands, the Moriori lost a significant part of their population because they were exposed to diseases that they were not used to. Some of those diseases include smallpox, the flu, tuberculosis, malaria, plague, measles, and cholera. Many of these diseases are crowd diseases. COVID-19 is a crowd disease as well, as we know this as super spreader events. So if you're in a crowded area, the disease is going to spread quickly. We see historically this happened in Europe between 1346 and 1353 a number of times. The Black Plague, which led to a loss of 30 to 40% of Europe. Now we know that this loss of people in Europe led to significant changes in society in Europe, so that the family farm disappeared, and we had the development of the beginnings of marketization. This obviously had a significant impact on European civilization, and that cannot be underspoken. We also saw the cholera epidemic in London in 1853 led to 10,000 people dying in London. So these crowd diseases can be terrible and can kill people, and they originated from living in close proximity with animals. What happens is that the Europeans come to the Americas and expose Americas primarily to smallpox, but other diseases, so that 95% of the native population is killed, not by European ingenuity, not by European weapons, but simply because they were exposed to something the Europeans didn't even have an awareness of, the diseases they brought along with them. So that the native population probably fell from 20 million people lost around 20 million people. We talked in an earlier lecture how smallpox killed the Inca emperor, which led to a civil war, which led to a small Spanish force taking over the Inca Empire and enslaving those people. Similar sort of thing happened with the Aztecs, with 50% of the Aztecs dying. And between 1519 and 1618, the Mexican population dropped from 20 million to about 1.6 million. One of the things that you learn from reading Native American histories is that the Native Americans realized how many people were living in the eastern colonies in places like Boston and Philadelphia, and that the Native American population could not equal that amount of population, because their population had been decimated by disease. As far as we know, all of these diseases originated from Europeans and came to Native Americans. There was a hypothesis that Native Americans gave Europeans syphilis, but that hypothesis has been brought into question. So what we see right away is that because of the advantages of luck of the Fertile Crescent with domesticable animals, Europeans developed diseases and a herd immunity to these diseases that Native Americans didn't have. So rather than facing millions of people in trying to invade and conquer the Americas, what ended up happening is that the Europeans faced a limited resistance that gave them a significant advantage. We want to now turn to the proximate cause of technology. And Diamond writes that there were differences in all aspects of technology, and these differences stemmed from Eurasia's much longer history of a densely populated, economically specialized, politically centralized, interacting and competing societies dependent on food production. We're only going to look at a segment of this argument for time purposes, but because the point is already had with our earlier lectures. So, what do we need for the development of technology? We need a history of resource allocation that frees certain people to become specialists. That means we need a settled population in which some people do not have to raise crops, and they can develop technologies, for instance, for raising crops, but also for developing weapons or developing, say, maritime skills, writing, and other such things. We know that the Industrial Revolution happened between 1750 and 1850 AD. So this is some 10,000 to 10,000 to 11,000 years after um, the domestication of food in Eurasia. And we also know that the Americas had a 9,000 year lag time between the domestication of food sources. So it would have been a long time before they had the ability to develop the technology that the Europeans had. So uh, there's lots of involved here in this history, and I encourage you to explore that. We want to move on towards the specialization that comes with technology, and one of the primary ideas here. So growing up, I learned that invention is the mother of necessity, and that it was the intelligence of a variety of people that made certain technologies, like the Gatling gun pictured here. Had it not been for the Gatling gun, certainly it would have been much more difficult for the European Genesis Americans to have taken over the uh, uh, Western Native Americans in their wars. But in fact, what we see is that technology develops by happenstance, and that it depends on predecessary technology. So if we look simply at the development of gunpowder and gasoline, which are so significant for us today, we see that it had kind of this erratic development from 2000 BC onward. So in 2000 BC, Mesopotamians are actually extracting petroleum, which is what we use, of course, for gasoline. But gasoline was actually put aside as just a leftover. It wasn't something that they used. Ancient Greeks were able to use petroleum and pitch to make their incendiary weapons, but again, it was something that was not developed in such a way that it was a process uh, that was intentional. And we see, in fact, that medieval Islamic alchemists were using this petroleum to steer perfumes, and so again, uh, they let go of many of the things that could have been used for weapons. And in 1100 AD, the chemical for gunpowder is just one of seven recipes that is developed there. And so it wasn't really used to develop weapons until much later. Uh, so technology develops in fits and starts, and it has predecessors. Now, what we see is that technology leads to that autocatalytic process, so that the development of industrialization led to greater food sources and also more access to goods, so that between 1750 and 1850, European population developed much quickly, so that to almost doubling. So they're better fed and more resistant to disease than the native peoples of the Americas. We also see that they have, sorry, I did not mean to do that. We also see that they have a larger urban population, so that before 1800, less than 10% of Europe would have been urbanized, and with 1800, about 50% of Europe would have been urbanized. These are things that people in Americas would not have been exposed to. They would not have had the technology or the history of developing the kinds of technologies that Eurasia had, because they simply did not have that amount of history to develop, because they didn't have those food groups available to them. So, Diamond's final conclusions. If we want to answer the question that Yali asked, why did Europeans come to conquer the rest of the world? It has nothing to do with racial characteristics, and much to do with the advantages of geography that led to food and domesticable animals in Eurasia that other parts of the world did not have. That guns, germs, and steel require a significant amount of time for development, including living in close proximity with domesticable animals that other peoples did not have. And so it is not race but luck that led to Europeans dominating the world.